You noticed that relief arrived, but it didn't stay. It showed up briefly, often after something settled or passed, and then it quietly moved on. Nothing dramatic followed. There was no sharp drop, just a return to a familiar baseline you recognized. It happened after conversations that ended without conflict, after moments where things went smoothly, after you thought for a second that the tension had lifted. You would feel lighter, just enough to notice it, and then the feeling would thin out. Relief came in small doses: a calm afternoon, a quiet evening, a stretch of time where nothing went wrong. You noticed those moments because they stood out. They felt different from the rest. You didn't celebrate them, you didn't mark them as turning points. You just registered them and kept going. Relief felt temporary by nature, like something you borrowed and returned without thinking. You noticed how quickly your body adjusted back. Your shoulders would lower for a moment, then slowly rise again. Your breathing would deepen, then return to its usual rhythm. Nothing forced it. It just happened. This didn't only happen after big events. It showed up after ordinary ones, too. A message that didn't escalate, a day that ended quietly, a decision that didn't lead to consequences. Even then, the relief faded. You noticed that you didn't lean into it. You didn't relax fully when it arrived. You let it pass through you, but you didn't settle inside it. From the outside, things looked fine. There was no obvious reason to stay alert. Nothing was actively wrong. Still, the relief didn't take hold. You didn't question it at first. You assumed that was just how relief worked. Brief, light, something that came and went. You remembered times when relief felt fuller, when it lasted longer. That memory didn't feel painful. It felt distant, like something that belonged to a different pace of life. Now, relief felt like a pause rather than a state. A momentary easing that didn't change much. You noticed that pattern quietly, and you kept going. Over time, you began to notice how predictable it was. Relief would arrive after something passed, and you already knew it wouldn't last. You could almost feel the shape of it before it happened. A brief easing, then a quiet return to alertness. You noticed this after disagreements that resolved quickly, after conversations that stayed calm, after moments where you thought, "This is over now." Relief came, but it stayed shallow. It didn't settle in your body. It hovered and then faded. You noticed it in your routines, at the end of the day, after sending a message and receiving a neutral reply, after plans went smoothly. Even when nothing went wrong, relief still slipped away. It didn't depend on the size of the situation. Big or small, the pattern stayed the same. Relief showed up briefly, then dissolved, leaving you in the same watchful place you started from. You noticed how your body never fully trusted it. You didn't stretch into it. You didn't let yourself rest inside it. Part of you stayed ready, as if something might still change. You noticed how quickly you moved on once it passed. You didn't miss it. You didn't chase it. You just adjusted back into readiness, like returning to a familiar posture. Sometimes you could feel it leaving, a slight tightening, a subtle shift in your breath. Nothing sharp, just a quiet reset. You noticed how often you told yourself this was normal, that relief was always temporary, that it wasn't meant to last. You accepted that explanation without examining it. You noticed how rarely you expected relief to stay anymore, how little you counted on it, how quickly you returned to scanning, adjusting, preparing. It became part of your rhythm. Something passes, relief appears, relief leaves. You continue. You noticed this in relationships, in work, in quiet moments alone. The setting didn't change the pattern. You didn't feel disappointed when relief faded. You felt unsurprised. That was what stood out. You weren't shocked when it left. You expected it to. Over time, you began to notice what that did to you. Not all at once, not in a way that demanded attention. More like a slow adjustment you made without realizing you were making it. You noticed that your body stopped fully standing down. Even when things felt okay, you stayed slightly braced. Not tense exactly, just ready. Like you never fully left the position of waiting. You found it harder to sink into moments of ease. When things were quiet, part of you stayed alert, listening for the next shift. You enjoyed calm, but you didn't trust it to hold. You noticed how quickly your mind moved on from relief. Instead of resting, you planned. Instead of settling, you scanned ahead. What's next? What could change? What might need attention? It didn't feel anxious in a loud way. It felt practical, like staying prepared, like not getting caught off guard. You told yourself this was just how you stayed steady. But you also noticed the cost. You felt tired in a way that rest didn't fully touch. Even after calm days, something in you stayed awake. You noticed how rarely you felt finished, like something had truly resolved. Even when situations ended cleanly, your body didn't mark them as complete. You carried a low-level vigilance that followed you into quiet moments, into evenings, into time alone. Relief didn't create rest. It just created a short pause before readiness returned. You noticed how this shaped your expectations. You stopped imagining long stretches of ease. You stopped assuming things would stay settled. Relief became something you acknowledged briefly, not something you relied on. You noticed how this affected your sense of safety. Not in obvious ways. You weren't afraid. You just stayed slightly removed from ease, as if fully relaxing would be premature. You learned to live without expecting relief to hold. You adapted to its short visits. You adjusted your body around that reality. It didn't feel dramatic, it felt reasonable. But you could feel the quiet narrowing that came with it, the way your world stayed manageable but smaller, the way calm never quite opened into rest. And you began to notice that, too. At some point, you stopped being surprised by it. You no longer expected relief to stay, and you no longer questioned why. You noticed how naturally you moved past it, how little space you gave it once it appeared. You saw how often you treated relief as a signal rather than a state, a sign that something had passed, a brief confirmation that nothing was wrong in that moment. Not something to settle into, not something to trust. You noticed how quickly your attention shifted back outward, back to monitoring, back to noticing small changes, back to staying ready. Relief didn't change that direction, it only interrupted it briefly. You realized that relief never led to rest. It led to a pause, a momentary easing that didn't alter how you held yourself afterward. Your body didn't reorganize around it. It simply acknowledged it and moved on. You noticed how early you had learned this rhythm, how familiar it felt to let relief pass without leaning into it, how little disappointment you felt when it left, as if you had never expected anything else. You saw how often you told yourself that this was maturity, that not clinging to relief was a form of balance, that staying alert was sensible. You didn't challenge those ideas. You just lived inside them. You noticed how rarely you allowed yourself to believe that things were truly settled, how even in calm periods you waited for the next adjustment, the next shift, the next thing that would need your attention. You realized that relief wasn't something you had lost. It was something you had never learned to keep. You noticed how that truth sat in your body, not heavily, not sharply, just clearly, like a sentence that didn't need emphasis. You weren't resisting relief. You were prepared for its absence. That was the truth. There is a point where you simply see it, not as a flaw, not as something to correct, just as a pattern that has been shaping how you move through time. Relief comes, and you already know how it will leave. The recognition doesn't arrive loudly. It doesn't demand anything from you. It settles in quietly, like noticing the weather without needing it to change. You notice how familiar it feels to keep moving past relief, how natural it has become to treat calm as temporary, how little space you give yourself to linger when things feel okay. Nothing needs to be fixed here. There is no instruction hiding in this moment, no lesson waiting to be applied. This isn't about learning how to relax better or trust more deeply. It's just noticing. You notice how your body stays oriented toward what's next, how readiness has become your resting position, how relief passes through without rearranging anything. You don't push against that understanding. You don't soften it. You don't dramatize it. You let it stand as a simple truth about how things have been. You notice how long you've lived this way, how early it started, how reasonable it felt at the time, how little it ever asked of you on the surface, and how much it quietly shaped underneath. The awareness doesn't create urgency. It doesn't demand a shift. It doesn't promise change. It just brings clarity. You see that relief was never meant to last in your body, not because you failed to hold it, not because you did anything wrong, just because you learned to move on before it could settle. You don't reach for meaning beyond that. You don't turn it into hope or resignation. You don't frame it as loss or protection. You let the recognition sit exactly where it lands. No resolution follows. No next step appears. No reassurance is offered. Just the quiet understanding. When relief never lasted,